Once again, a Consumer Reports expose on heavy metals in food has caused mild panic. And this time, they're coming for our protein powder. So let's take a closer look at whether that post-workout smoothie is still safe to drink. Hello and welcome to the Nutrition Diva podcast, a show where we take a closer look at the latest nutrition headlines and memes and sort fact from fiction. I'm your host, Monica Reinagel, and today I want to talk about a new report on lead in protein powders that has many of you concerned. Protein powders are a daily habit for many people, myself included, and when you see headlines about something that you use regularly linked to a toxic metal, it's hard not to feel alarmed by that. One listener wrote in to ask whether they should be worried about the fact that they were using protein powder to meet their protein targets, and also wondered what this might mean for teens or young adults who also use them. Now, lead in food is a legitimate concern because this is a cumulative toxin. It builds up in the body over time, and it affects multiple organ systems, especially the nervous system and the brain. In children and during pregnancy, even small amounts of lead exposure can interfere with development. And in adults, chronic exposure has been linked to hypertension, kidney damage, even cognitive decline. So yes, this is something worth taking seriously. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to toss that expensive tub of protein powder in the trash. So I want to take a closer look at what this investigation found and how we should interpret that information. Consumer Reports tested 23 popular protein supplements and shakes, and they found that about 70% of them contained levels of lead that the magazine found concerning. Now, to be clear, these products were not in violation of any official regulations. This was a case of the products not meeting a benchmark that had been developed by Consumer Reports' own internal food safety experts, which turned out to be quite a bit more conservative than other regulatory guidance. Now, there's really no amount of lead that could be considered safe, but regulators and public health agencies also acknowledge that it would be virtually impossible to completely avoid it. And so the goal is simply to keep our exposures as low as possible. Current FDA guidance for adults is for lead exposure not to exceed about 12.5 micrograms per day, or about 8.8 micrograms for women who may become pregnant. California's Proposition 65 standard is far stricter. It caps total daily lead exposure from any consumer product at just 0.5 micrograms per day. That's roughly 25 times lower than the FDA's adult benchmark, and they require warning labels on any product that exceeds that amount. Now, Consumer Reports' level of concern was even stricter than California's. And it's important to understand that these more conservative thresholds are really intended to raise an early warning flag and not to indicate that these foods are toxic or unsafe. So with that background in mind, let's dig into some of the details. Perhaps my biggest takeaway was that plant-based protein powders contained roughly 9 times more lead on average than dairy-based products, such as whey protein. And this is because the crops that are typically used in plant-based protein powders, such as peas and soy and rice, naturally absorb heavy metals from the soil in which they are grown. And those contaminants then become concentrated when the proteins are isolated and dried to make a powder. It's also worth noting that the results from 2025 were also worse than those reported by Consumer Reports back in 2010. Average lead levels were higher, and fewer of the products tested had undetectable amounts. All of this raises the question of whether anyone really needs to be using protein powders in the first place. Most children and adults in the US meet or even exceed the recommended dietary allowance for protein. Adolescent girls are the group that is most likely to fall short, especially if they are following restrictive diets. And that was something that I talked about in more detail in our special series earlier this year on bone health through the lifespan. But these recommended allowances for protein only represent the minimum amount needed to avoid deficiency, not necessarily the optimal amount for preserving muscle or supporting recovery or promoting healthy aging. In recent years, a growing body of research has shown that many people, especially adults over 50, athletes, those recovering from illness or injury, and anyone intentionally losing weight, can benefit from protein intakes 1.5 to 2.5 times that RDA. Those higher levels can help maintain lean body mass and also improve satiety. Protein recommendations are usually given as a certain number of grams per kilogram of body weight, and that can be a bit cumbersome to calculate. And because this topic comes up so much in talks that I give, I actually built a little calculator that allows you to enter your body weight, and it will then calculate what those different protein recommendations amount to for you. If you want to check that out, you'll find it at nutritionovereasy.com/calculator. Now, it is entirely possible to reach those higher protein targets through food alone, but I can tell you from my own experience working with scores of clients, as well as my own personal experience, that it is not always easy. It can be tough to get enough protein without overdoing calories, especially if you're on a predominantly plant-based diet. And even for meat eaters, getting a decent dose of protein at breakfast can be a challenge. And protein powders can be a convenient way to close that gap. The key is to make sure that you're using these to supplement a healthy, balanced diet, not to replace one. And that's why I generally recommend plain, unflavored protein powders instead of the sweetened, flavored powders and shakes that are often tricked out with all kinds of added vitamins and minerals and adaptogens and powdered greens. I'd encourage you to think of protein powders as a convenient way to supply extra protein and not as a kitchen sink style nutrition panacea. And as to whether you should change anything that you're doing based on this latest consumer report, here's my take on that. This investigation reveals some genuine quality control issues, but in my opinion, it does not reflect a public health emergency. The greatest concern really would be for people who are using some of those higher lead products on a daily basis, because over months or years, that could potentially push your cumulative exposure beyond acceptable levels. And that's especially true for children, adolescents, and women who are pregnant or hoping to become pregnant. Even if you're not in one of those groups, if you are using protein powder on a daily or a near daily basis to help meet your protein goals, you might consider switching to a whey-based protein powder because these tend to contain less lead. If you prefer to use a plant-based protein powder, look for one that has been independently tested and certified to be low in contaminants. So you can look for third-party verification such as NSF, USP, or Informed Choice, or you might check whether the manufacturer publishes recent heavy metal test results. You could also keep an eye out for a Prop 65 warning on the label that would indicate that the product exceeds California's ultra-strict 0.5 microgram per day limit for lead. And if you are concerned about lead contamination, this issue certainly isn't limited to protein powders. The biggest sources for most people are not in food, but in their environment. Old plumbing and paint in homes built before 1978. Drinking water that passes through older lead pipes can be a particularly significant contributor. So if you are in a home with older plumbing, you might want to let the water run for a few moments before you use it in foods or beverages or cooking. Or better yet, use a water filter that filters out lead. And another best practice is not to use hot water from the tap for cooking. Use water from the cold tap and then heat it on the stove. I hope that all of this helps put those latest headlines into perspective for you. If you have a question or a topic you'd like me to tackle on the podcast, you can email me at nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. And if you'd like to find out about having me speak at your next in-person or virtual event, you can learn more at wellnessworkshere.com. Nutrition Diva is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Holly Hutchings is our director of podcasts. Steve Riekeberg is my audio engineer. Morgan Christensen heads up podcast operations and advertising. Rebecca Sebastian is our marketing manager of publicity. And Nat Hoops is our marketing assistant. Thanks to all of them, and thanks to you for listening.